Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And this is the first in a mammoth series about the war crimes trials. But in 1945, much of the world was broken. Millions of displaced personnel, POWs, and victorious soldiers filled the cities. As preparations for the war crimes trials began, many Nazis were on the run. Guy Walters, today's guest, wrote about the ensuing search in hunting evil. There's my copy there. You can find links to it below, as you can his Substack, where you can get lots and lots more Guy Walters pontificating about history. He joins us now. Good afternoon, sir. How are you today?
Good day to you all, and good day to all my friends on social media and in real life. How are you all? I'm sorry, I'm at my parents' house at the moment, and I'm in the spare bedroom, and as you can see, I'm on a bed.
It's all very good. So the thing about the war crimes trials, Guy, is that a lot of the main perpetrators were dead. Hitler, Goebbels, Himmler, they were dead. While all the preparations are being made for how they're going to set up it legally, they're dealing with, as I say, there are all these people who are displaced there. The hunt is on for those who they want to bring to justice. So, you know, as we're going to bring up your slides now, you could have spent years and years and years writing about the hunt for every single perpetrator of the crime. How did you before we bring up the slides, how did you begin the process?
Right. So, I mean, first of all, I remember talking to a wife of a war crimes investigator, and she said to me, "You know what Gerald, my husband, Gerald Draper, said to me is that I was completely unprepared for the volume of criminality that was there at the end of the war, and there was this thing called the Central Registry of War Crimes Suspects and Security Suspects, and that thing is 60,000 people long." Right. So, Woody, let's do 60,000 manhunts right now, right? How long is that going to take with modern, tech, cars, nice roads, all that stuff? Now, imagine that at 45 to 48.
Yeah.
60,000 manhunts, you're not going to do it. You're not going to do it. So I think that what the Allies had to do was they had to do, and how do I do the slides like that?
There you go. Yeah.
Is that working? So what the Allies had to do is pretty much what I had to do in my book, Hunting Evil, is that they had to try and cherry pick the big names. Who are the names that are going to make people, absolutely, sit up and pay attention. And so my focus was always, as indeed were the Allies, is let's go for like top left, Martin Bormann. Big name. Did he die at the end of the war? Some people might think that he didn't. Adolf Eichmann, a man who needs no introduction to anybody on WW2 TV, right?
Yeah.
I hope. Joseph Mengele, top right, another major war criminal. No, again, not a man who needs any introduction, but at the same time was on the run. Erich Priebke, bit more of a troubling individual. A man I interviewed, I'll talk to him a little bit later, was an SS captain in Rome. Franz Stangl. Woody, do you know who he is?
I know the name, but I'm not placing where he was.
Okay,
but the name...
you've heard of a camp called Treblinka.
Of course, yeah.
He was the commandant of Treblinka. That man murdered within 11 months 800,000 people. Okay, I think we can call him a bad man.
Yeah.
And then Ante Pavelic was the puppet dictator of Croatia during the war. Now, I just took those six as people who are emblematic of people who are hunted. And in some ways, the Allies did the same thing. But what we got to do, we got to go back to the Moscow Declaration of October 1943, in which the Allies said to the occupied nations, we are going to hunt these people. We're going to pursue them to the uttermost ends of the earth, and we'll deliver them to the accusers in order that justice may be done. Fine words, right? I mean, if you're in the Allied territories, you would have thought that's absolutely fine. And as a result of that, by the time the war ends, we have this road to Nuremberg, in which you have how many people in the dock at Nuremberg? 18? Right? That is nothing compared to the 60 to 100,000 people who have committed war crimes, right? Nothing. What's your maths like?
Oh, that's why I do history. Don't do me math.
It's like 0.018 or
Yeah.
0.0018 or whatever, something like that, right? So what happens is that, you know, the Allies had cherry picked very much, you know, those people. But what you also have is this thing called Crocas on the left. And do you see that cover, that book?
Yep.
Okay. Those are the consolidated wanted lists. And that is the central registry of war crimes, war criminals, and security suspects. And that is where, you know, at the end of the war, it was decided by this new organization called the United Nations, decided, even before the UN Charter even happened in 1946, that this is where we're going to draw up all these people. And we're going to draw up these massive lists. And we were going to be very, very proud of the fact that we're going to bring these people to justice, like under the Moscow Declaration. And there was this press conference. And at this press conference, the United Nations, fledgling, said, here are war criminals. And then one journalist turned around and said, I see one name missing from this list. And bear in mind, this is late 1944. And this journalist said, I don't see the name A. Hitler on the list. Right? I mean, this is the kind of inefficiency, the insanity, the bad bureaucracy of these organizations. And this is how the whole, what I argue in my book, is that the whole idea of hunting war criminals was completely amateur.
And in 1943 and 44, Guy, this was theoretically the high point of the cooperation between the Western Allies, the Soviets, everybody theoretically singing from the same hymn sheet, moving in the same direction. By 1945, it's all splintering and people's ambitions are changing. So if it was tough in 43, 44, it's only going to get worse a year later.
Exactly. That's such a good point. Such a good point. And so the idea that there was any kind of collegiality between the Russians, the French, the Americans, and the British is farcical. You know, it's just not going to happen. And so as a result, and we see this slide here, I talk about the early hunters. So you know, there were, I assume that most of our friends watching may be British or American Nazi hunters, but the British had a war crimes unit. And so the chap I mentioned, his wife at the top, that is Gerald Draper, top left, and a man called Tony Summerhoff next to him. He it was his widow had said, you know, he was unaware of how much criminality it was. And that is him, bottom middle. Do you see that one, bottom middle?
Yeah.
And there's a man in the white t-shirt looking a bit scared. That is Gerald Draper shouting with his hands on his hips at Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz. It's like, you know, it's the kind of bollocking face writ large, right? You know, and you can see the scared face. I don't know if we can zoom on these slides.
No, but we can see it. We can all see it. It's good.
See it. And anybody, please just Google Gerald Draper, Rudolf Höss, Hoess, and you will find that slide. If you want to see a Brit bollocking a German, that is the one to watch. But actually, Höss, obviously, his commandant of Auschwitz, was you know, a absolutely prima facie case of someone who needed that kind of treatment, and he was hanged. So you've got these major, you know, level of war criminals who could be hunted down very, very quickly. But you've got, you know, after your top kind of, you know, now that's what I call music greatest hits, 500 Nazis. You know, you've still going to have hundreds of thousands of people. Now, look at the left of that slide. The nice looking chap on the left with, I think he's got some, Woody, you could probably identify his uniform, but I know his man called.
He's got a Sam Brown belt on by the look of it. Yeah.
Yeah, 100% that one. Some sort of nice wingy stuff. Man called Ian Nielsen. He headed the British War Crimes Unit at the end of the war. And I interviewed him in 2006, about 20 years ago, in Marlborough, in Wiltshire, in southern UK, where he lived. And I said, did you have the consolidated wanted list, Crocas? So I've just gone back to, that black thing there.
Mm.
And I had a facsimile of it. It's about that thick, right? Literally that thick, 60,000 names. And he said to me in 2006, said, I was head of the war crimes unit. And he said to me, that is the first time I've ever seen that. That is what a mess it was. So, and so the whole thing, you've got to imagine the chaos of war, post-war Germany. What are people doing there? Are they really going to invest in all these war crimes teams running around? They're not. You know what? Hunting war criminals was a kind of an afterthought. It was kind of like the pudding that no one wanted.
Yeah.
You know what? It was a nice idea, but you know what? Let's just wrap up dinner and let's get on to the next meal. And the next meal being, of course, the Soviet Union. So in a way, that's why, official Nazi hunting, guys on the left, the Brits, and I don't have a slide with the Americans, it peters out after 3 years. And then you get kind of individual efforts by typically Jewish Nazi hunters. And those are the guys on the right of this slide.
Yeah.
Tobias Friedman, top right. But a more problematic figure for me is Simon Wiesenthal on the bottom right of that slide. I'll talk about him a little bit. So as a result, the point I want to really ram home is that Nazi hunting, it was amateur, it was slack, it was lazy, it was, it was pathetic. And the technology, the cars, I remember looking at the Canadians war crime unit, and I saw a file in the National Archives in which they said back in London, could you send us a German dictionary? And London said, no, we can't. We can't send you a German dictionary. It's if you were on the run as a Nazi in 45, you were laughing. You were absolutely laughing.
Another point, just to interrupt you while you're drinking, is there's also, and we're going to talk to Richard Golson tomorrow about the trial of Barbie, 4 decades later, is that, with your work on The Great Escape, there's trying people for specific crimes. You took this person in a car and you shot them in the back of the head in this place. And then there's that broader complication of the crimes against humanity, the fact that you yourself may not have committed any crimes, but you were ordering other people to do stuff on a big level, which is something I don't think any of these people in 45 realized how complicated that was going to get legally.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm less well qualified to talk about that, but I think that there was a very famous case at the end of the First World War called the Llandovery Castle case. And the Llandovery Castle case was, and again, I'm going to make some errors here. It was when a German U-boat had, at the end of the First World War, had mowed down a lot of people in the water. Horrible crime, blah, blah, blah. And the trial was, and this is, kind of pre-Geneva protocols. The trial was that, and this proved this idea that to follow an order you knew to be illegal was wrong. So, and as a result of the Llandovery Castle, which was a liner that had been sunk, and the U-boat had murdered all the people on it. As a result of that trial, which the Germans signed up to before the war, it had been agreed that it was basically in international law illegal to follow an order from a superior officer that you knew to be wrong. So, Woody, if you are my captain, I'm your lieutenant, and you say, let's go and shoot all those unarmed prisoners over there. Right. If I, follow your order knowing it to be illegal, I too have committed a crime.
Yeah.
And this is really important. So what's called the Nuremberg defense, and you're going to hear this throughout this series, about I was only following orders. Bullshit. Total bullshit. because this is what had been established at the end of the First World War.
Yeah.
And so when people talk about the Nuremberg defense, those Nazis in the dock at Nuremberg and all the subsequent trials going about the Nuremberg defense, it was crap. They knew under even German law that this was not an acceptable defense. You cannot knowingly follow an order that you know to be wrong. Now, you might turn around and go, but Guy, I'm Captain Woody and you're Lieutenant Walters. If you don't follow this order, I'm going to shoot you, right? Which you might do. That is a defense. If I know that you're going to kill me and I don't then kill other people, that's fine. Kind of off the hook. But you know what? How many people do you think after the Second World War during the war in Germany, in Nazi Germany, got actually executed for not following orders by their superior German officer?
Well, I mean, it's very few, if not. I mean, this is one of the revelations in your work.
It's basically none. It's basically none.
The war film trope of you will be sent to the Russian front.
Exactly.
All that kind of stuff. It's a trope. It doesn't happen.
It's a total trope. And when I'm doing, and you mentioned my Great Escape book kindly earlier, when I was researching that, the head of the Gestapo in Strasbourg, a man called Schimmel, who had been responsible for executing some of the Great Escapers, he was asked in court in his trial what he said that I had one of my guys refuse to do the executions, and they said, "What did you do to him?" And he said, "I just let him off." He was a Gestapo senior officer. You know, this whole idea that there was this network of insistence you had to commit crimes is crap. It's absolute rubbish. So anyway, I think that you're going to talk about a lot in this series. Yep. So I may have overstepped my mark here, Woody, but you know, it is. I'm afraid, you know, German law and British law and American law very much coincide in the 20s and 30s. So the people operating during the war on whatever side, I'm not talking about the Soviet Union, but I'm talking about, you know, the European nations at war were very much fighting under the same ethico-moral legal code, if that doesn't sound too pompous.
Yeah, makes sense. Thank you very much for clearing that up. And yes, we will be going into great depth about that. But this is a nice starting show, so we can explore various themes. But back to you and your slides.
Okay, good. So when I was talking about, you know, Nazi war criminals, so obviously we're talking about the people, the hunters and those escaping, the hunted, but also what I wanted to talk about were the helpers. And, you know, a lot of people say, well, how do the Nazis escape? And everyone goes, the Vatican, the Pope, blah, 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 blah. You know, and you go, well, maybe, well done. Were there elements of the Catholic Church that helped the Nazis escape? You bet. Did the Pope and the Catholic Church, the Vatican, as a corporation, help people escape? No. There was no kind of corporate policy to do that. Nevertheless, if you see in the middle of this slide, a man called Bishop Alois or Luigi Hudal, he was the head of the German-Austrian seminary in Rome, and he did help Nazis escape. And the Nazis he helped escape, and I went and found their files in his archives, were Eric Priebke, bottom left, and Franz Stangl, bottom middle. Okay, and when I went to Hudal's archive about 20 years ago, I said to the archivist, I'm looking for, you know, elements that prove that Hudal is helped these people escape. And then Dr. Johannix, who's a good friend, said, Guy, you're always looking for bloody swastikas. And I go, well, that's how I make my living.
Do.
That's how we all make our living. And he goes, there are no swastikas in my archive. Within 2 minutes, I got the CV written by Franz Stangl in the middle, Commandant of Treblinka, written under his own name, saying, I need your help to get a Red Cross passport to get to another part of the world. All right. And he said, all right, well, that's just one. Then 2 minutes later, I found another CV or Lebenslauf written by Eric Priebke, who called himself Otto Pape. So that's the guy bottom left of that slide. And I went, look, there are a lot of bloody swastikas here, Johan. And this is in just one seminary. So the defense is that is not technically part of the the Vatican. That is a seminary in Rome. Don't have time to go into all these other guys now, but don't forget that basically where a lot of Nazis wanted to go was Argentina. So bottom right, Juan Perón, sympathetic, fascist state. They like Nazis politically. Massive German emigration there in the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th. But I also write about in my book about this man called Arnold Lees. Do you see him bottom left?
Yeah.
He was a vet based in Guildford, 20 Pewley Hill, Surrey, Guildford, Surrey. Now, if you can see very clearly, he has got a Union Jack armband. Do you see it in a black shirt?
Yeah, yeah.
Now, obviously, the resolution's not going to be great, but on his Union Jack, there's a little swastika, I think. He is Britain's first elected fascist. Actually, so he was a councillor for Stamford, I think in Lincolnshire, and he was a camel doctor, and he was not a nice man.
Mm.
And at the end of the war, he wrote all these pamphlets about saying why the Jews are evil and so on and so forth. And he decided that he was going to help some Nazis, 2 Dutch SS men, escape from Kempton Park Racecourse, and they hid in his house in Surrey. So, when I write about Nazis escaping, it's not just like through the rat lines across the Alps. It's also through, the on the green bus line in Surrey. He was not a nice man. And then also one person I found out a lot about was Clarita Stauffer, top right, who helped a lot of Nazis escape through Spain. So, it was Spain, Argentina, and I think people also forget the Middle East was a very popular place for people to escape.
And we had a question from Fraser about someone like Houdel's motivation there. So I'm assuming it's either support broadly for the ideology and sympathy for the Nazis and cash, and possibly both.
Good question, Fraser. I think Fraser, sorry, not Frazier. I think that Houdel's motivation was very much he was an Austrian German nationalist. Saying that, it's very complicated because people are complicated. Did he just help Nazis escape? Yeah, but did he help Jews, flee to, Palestine in the early 40s? Yeah, he did. So I think he had a literal broad church of people escaping. But no, Houdel's motivation was ultimately, anyone who turns up probably deserves my help. If you are German, I'm a German nationalist or German Austrian nationalist, you deserve my help. And am I going to ask too many questions? No. And actually, here we go on this slide, top right, that little kind of squiggles there. That is my photo of Stangl, Commandant Treblinka's CV that he gave to Houdal in Rome. Now, how do these people get out? And how they get out is through typically people certifying Red Cross passports. And so, if you had a Red Cross passport, you could pretty much go anywhere. Today there's, I don't know, maybe there is such a thing. I don't know. But, you would need some form of documentation issued by the Red Cross to say you are the person, people said you were. And you've got to kind of imagine it's kind of like Gaza today, but all of Europe or Central Europe like Gaza today. There's a lot of flattened places, a lot of flattened towns, a lot of people on the move. Yeah, you got to times that by 50. It's like 50, 60 million people on the move. What can you do? So ultimately, the Red Cross was there to kind of, issued temporary passports. People can go wherever they like. And so what you've got there is a classic example of a passport with that big red stamp, and that passport, that nice man in the bow tie. Woody, how old are you? Do you remember Grange Hill?
56.
What?
56.
So you remember Grange Hill? You're British, right?
Of course. Yeah.
Do you remember Mr. Bronson from Grange Hill?
Yeah, Michael Sheard, yeah.
Michael, yeah. Who did play Hitler.
Yeah.
But I think that, and again, Eichmann in that Red Cross passport looks like Mr. Bronson from Grange Hill.
He does. You're going to give me nightmares now, guy.
I even, so I'm 54, so we're basically the same age. And I even put that in the footnote of my book. And my friend on social media, Catherine Cantalena, otherwise known as ICOD, who some people will follow, she literally was the only person I know who's seen that footnote in my book. Said, I can't believe you've put Mr. Bronson from Grange Hill as an endnote in a book about Nazi hunting. But anyway, there it is. So
it's the 7 degrees of separation, isn't it?
It is 7
You can connect anybody to anybody else. Yeah,
exactly. So anyway, so I've and again, where you see that word Genoa, that is Eichmann escaping from Genoa on a boat to get across the Atlantic. Through the Mediterranean across the Atlantic. So it's basically the Red Cross basically not having too many checks and balances. And obviously, obvious point here is that there's no database. There's no digital, there's no QR codes, none of that crap. It's a very, very, murky place in which people basically turn up and they self-assert who they are. That chap with the moustache and beard, that is Ante Pavlich. Just to go back a few slides, that's Pavlich bottom right. Here he is in Rome, disguising himself. It's just like, it just looks crap, but that's all they needed. And then where it says the word Rome there with that nice building lit up, that's where Pavlich, the dictator of Croatia, ends up in this building in Rome, totally escaped, totally hidden.
And Veronica thanks you for mentioning him, because you said his policy killed her granddad. So she's grateful that you're talking about him as one of your 6 scumbags.
Veronica, I'm absolutely happy to have him as one of my scumbags. I mean, what a nasty man he was. There was this journalist, Kurtso Malaparte, who said that he once interviewed Pavlich, and in front of him he had a whole bowl of what looked like jellies. In fact, were eyeballs from the Jasenovac camp. Now, I don't think that's necessarily true, but the fact that people believe that means that, yes, certainly Pavlich was regarded as a particularly unpleasant individual. So very happy to confirm that.
And just quickly, while you got the photo of Rome there, I don't need an elaborate answer on this, but I think when you're talking about this book and this kind of work, is people's perception often that it is, secret airstrips and then landing in the Peruvian or Argentinian jungle and moving through rat-infested sewers, when in fact a lot of it is just moving through regulated passport controls.
I think that's absolutely true. I think that's absolutely right. I think that the bottom line is there are numerous escape routes through Europe. Okay, so first of all, Argentina. How do you get to Argentina? You basically walk over the Alps, which you can do. I've walked over the Brenner Pass for researching this book. You go to Genoa, which is where Eichmann did there, and you get on a boat. And if you've got a Red Cross passport, you're basically there. The Argentinians will let you in because they don't mind Nazis too much, because they're a bunch of fascists. Or the other holiday destination you can go to is the Middle East, because, the Middle East and the Arab nations at that time didn't really care too much about Nazis because they had a common enemy. They didn't like Jews very much. Or the other way you could do was just to lay undercover for a few years. And by then, the desire for vengeance wasn't that strong. And you could probably get away with a couple of years in the clink. Or you go to Spain. That was all right. You go to Spain. So the kind of idea that you had to, as you say, escape into deepest jungles. Nah, that's the romance of the story, if you like, but it's not really true. And so ultimately, their methods of escape were quite pedestrian, I suppose. You didn't need to, charter a plane to get you into deepest Paraguay straight away. You know what? Just hop on a boat from Genoa to Argentina with a false passport. Job done. Simple as that.
Thank you.
Now, I also talked a lot about the Odessa. Woody, you must have seen the Odessa file, right?
I love it. I know it's hokum, but I love it. Yeah.
So the word Odessa, according to Freddie Forsyth, top middle, who rest in peace, just died, stands for, in German, the Organization of Former SS Men.
Yeah.
Now, I'm going to put to you, if you had a secret society of former SS men, would you call it the Organization of Former SS Men?
No.
Of course you're not. Of course you're not. And so that is why, for that reason alone, the Odessa as an organization is not true. Nevertheless, I went to go and interview Freddie Forsyth about it. And he said, I heard all about it from this journalist called Anthony Terry of the Sunday Times, who in his book he calls Anthony Cadbury. And fans of English chocolate will know what he's done there, right? Cadbury's or Terry's, two big chocolate manufacturers here in the UK. And there was a lot of crap put around in the late 60s saying that there was this secret society that was helping Nazis escape. And I looked into it. And if you see bottom left, there was the Odessa symbol there, which is the letters of Odessa with two arrows going through it. And then there was another symbol, that squiggle that looks a bit like the artist formerly known as Prince symbol, right? And it's all Russian disinformation, because the Russians were desperately trying to prove that we were sheltering fascists. And so what you see in all the files is a load of disinformation being put around saying, you know what, there's these naughty, Brits, French, Americans, they're all sheltering these people. There are all these secret societies that are helping these people go about. And they're run by people like Otto Skorzeny, top right, Wilhelm Hertel, SD officer, friend of Eichmann's, in the middle, that black and white shot. And the man who really bought into this is the man bottom right, Simon Wiesenthal, who, I'm afraid not an admirer of, because, and I'll talk about him in a second. But there was this sort of became a self-perpetuating myth. And and I do as historians that, you know what, if you want to research something, don't go back to the book before or the interview before. Go back to the one at the beginning, right? And there is nothing that proves the Odessa existed. And when I went to interview Erich Priebke, bottom left, former SS officer in Rome who escaped in 1949 to Europe, and I said to him when I interviewed him in his house, his flat in Rome, and I said, well, Eric, was there an Odessa? And he said, you know what? I'm 100 years old. He literally was 100 years old. And he goes, you know what? I'm not going to lie to you. There really wasn't. Because when I turned up in Argentina, I wish there bloody was. Because I had no money. There was nothing there. There was no Odessa. I just got there under my own steam, my own cash, whatever there was. Was there a kind of network that helped people escape? Yeah, but in an informal way. In a way that, where I'm sitting, there might be someone 10 miles over there who might be politically sympathetic to me, who I've known about, and saying, look, I want to help my son escape. Could you help him? Yeah, of course. So there's a kind of informal network doing that. But was there this octopus going over the world with the Odessa? Nah, it doesn't add up. It just doesn't add up. And when I interviewed Freddie Forsyth, you know what? He said to me, yeah, it's probably bullshit. But you know what? He made a lot of money.
Yeah.
So I also talk about the refuges in the book, about the places where they ended up. And as you can see, some of these are very predictable choices, like Buenos Aires, Paraguay, Bariloche, and Hackney. We'll come on to Hackney in a minute. Now, Buenos Aires, obviously, everyone thinks popularly, quite rightly, that is where your kind of household Nazi names end up. And that indeed is where Eichmann ends up, where Joseph Mengele ends up. Not Martin Bormann, because he does die in Berlin in 1945. And that house at the top is that is Eichmann's house, where the Israelis found him in the late 50s, early 60s. You know, these people were not living like the boys from Brazil in grand old houses. And then you can see there that cafe. Again, those are sharp eyes. You can see it's the ABC Cafe. That is a picture I took of a German cafe in Buenos Aires in about 15 years ago. And that was there in the 50s. And we know that Eichmann and Mengele and various Nazis would go there completely openly.
Mm.
Why could they go there openly? There was no extradition treaty. Mengele, Joseph Mengele, as everyone knows, he listed himself in the Buenos Aires phone book as Jose Mengele. That is how well this guy.
That's like Obi-Wan Kenobi changing his name to Ben Kenobi and hoping no one noticed, although it did actually work in the movie. But that was, when I read that in your book, or I heard you talk about it, We Have Ways or Chalk Valley, wherever it was, that was a real mic drop moment for me. That he's because again, although we think they're living in opulence, we think they're living with everything in secret, and they've got fake names and they've got security. They're living in sort of not poverty as such. They're living in ordinary situations, but they're not particularly hiding, are they?
They're not in hiding. They don't need to be in hiding. There's no extradition. And which is why, you know, with the Eichmann kidnap, you know, Eichmann for a long time felt relatively safe. He went out there, 48. And, you know, the Israelis kidnapped in 1960. So he had lived 12 years free. But, you know what, he was living. And again, so when I see the slide, the black and white slide says Buenos Aires, and the slide immediately below that, the picture immediately below that, that bungalow with the greenery around it, you know, that was where he was living. You know, just a very modest bungalow there as well. You know, the whole idea that these guys were living, you know, high off the hog is just kind of insane. And, you know, it was Mengele who had some family money, because if you go to Bavaria, and I even was in Germany last week, I saw a trailer with the word Mengele on it because the family made a lot of farm equipment very successfully. You know, Mengele ended up bottom right slide, living in some quite nice houses in Argentina, and then he fled when Eichmann had been kidnapped to Paraguay. But that was living very down at heel for someone like Mengele. But, you know, again, Mengele wasn't like rich. He was just kind of prosperous. But no one was living like the boys from Brazil, you know, in jungles with topless natives and bars of gold and swastikas hanging down in laboratories. I mean, that was the romantic sort of kind of image of this stuff. I've got Hackney and Guildford there, which do look very, very strange. And I'm going to give you back to Arnold Lee's bottom left, our camel doctor, our veterinarian from Guildford. And, you know, he was a committed fascist after the war. And there were two Dutch SS men who escaped from Kempton Park Racecourse called Meyer and Teeken. And they turned up one day at Lee's house in Guildford, and that's the slide that obviously says Guildford. That is 20 Pewley Hill, Guildford. So if any of our viewers live in Surrey, tell them to go 20 Pewley Hill, Guildford, and there in the attic of that very nice house in Guildford, Lees stored 2 Dutch SS men in 1946 who wanted to escape. So this is kind of, a little strange, like a carry on Odessa story. So Lees then says to these 2 guys, well, I can't really help you that much, but what I can do is to send you to some friends in Hackney. So why do you get on the Green Line bus to Hackney and you can go there? So that is the house in Hackney where these 2 Dutch SS men by now in early 46 are living again in the attic of this place. They then go to the Argentine embassy and say, could you help us get to Argentina? And the Argentinians say, bog off, that's not going to happen. So Arnold Lees, and through the kind of still existing fascist networks in Britain after the war, say, okay, well, what we can do is we can get you down to a cattery in Littlehampton, like a boarding house for pets in Littlehampton, and then you can go and stay there in one of the kind of kennels or the place where the cats and dogs are kept. So you got these 2 Dutch S-men, probably in their early to mid 20s, sitting in Littlehampton, kind of on the Sussex coast. And then they try to make contact with a man called Captain Bat, who's got a boat on the River Hamble. And Captain Bat says, what do you want me to do? And they say, have you got a boat? And this is on the Hamble River, just a modest river. Mm. Have you got a boat that you can take us to Argentina with? I mean, we're old enough to remember the Falklands War, right? Yeah. Going from the south coast of Britain to Argentina, it's, I would say, an F of a long way.
But the little ships to Dunkirk is a little bit easier than to Argentina. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So the idea that you can sort of go to sequester a boat from the Hamble to get you down to Argentina, which is as far as the Falkland Islands, basically, is bullshit. Anyway, all the way through, and the reason why this story can be told is because MI5 and the police was shadowing all these post-war fascists, intercepting their post and intercepting their phone calls, and that's how we know. And they knew that these 2 Dutch SS men were traveling down what I call this very British Odessa in my book. They were following this path all the way through. And so what the security services did was go, well, let's see how far they go along this line. And then once they got to the end of the line, we'll round everybody up. And that's what they did.
Wow.
So you know what? It's Buenos Aires. It's Bariloche in Patagonia where Eric Priebke turned up. And it's Hackney and Guildford. So now I talk about the Nazis when they're in hiding, and that again is top left Ante Pavlich, which as I remember, I told you about. He was the one with the bucket of eyeballs and the comedy fake moustache and beard. He's now got rid of it. He's now in hiding in Argentina with his monstrously unattractive wife. And frankly, that's what he deserved. And he ends up getting shot and mortally wounded by some Yugoslavian communists who come to get him in the late 50s or late 60s. Eichmann is living, and the Eichmann story I think is well told and well known by your viewers, I'm sure, or our viewers. But this was a man, again, it proves that the Nazis weren't living in a big way. You know what? He was trying to do all sorts of things to make ends meet when he was in Argentina. And, that slide I have there, one way he tried to make a living was breeding Angora rabbits. Okay, so that's why you've got Eichmann with a fluffy bunny there, which seems, again, very discordant. He ends up working in a kind of automotive plant, in northern Buenos Aires, and living in this terrible house there, top right, that black and white, self-built house, no water, no running electricity, no water, whatever. And so when the Israelis do come along to kidnap him after a tip-off, they go, how is this guy, the architect of the Holocaust, why is he living in such a crap hole? Why we thought that he should be living in this kind of castle. Yet it's almost insulting to us, as a newfound nation of people who've had 6 million of our number murdered. How is this person who was responsible for so much of our death and destruction, how come he's living in this really modest place? It would help us as a people to know that he'd been living in some evil castle or some Death Star. But in fact, he's living in a bungalow, and this guy living in a bungalow helped to order 6 million of our deaths. Whatever.
Yeah.
So that was always a problem for the Israeli hunters. Mengele on the right is he does live in Argentina. He then gets the fear. He ends up in Paraguay. He ends up in Brazil. And have you got a cat, Woody?
I've got 2.
Do they ever get hairballs?
They do. Massive ones that are scary.
They get scary hairballs. And what do they vomit them out?
Yeah.
Mengele got a hairball. Like a cat, like what are your cats called?
Muffin and Charlie.
Okay,
it's
but
Charlie, because Charlie's very hairy. He gets these massive ones that look like half a Twix when they come out.
So Mengele got so nervous, he grew up his moustache. And what he did was he used to chew the ends of his moustache, right? And then eat it because of this nervous tick. And then he got a hairball. And cats are pretty good at regurgitating hairballs, as you will testify. But human beings are less good at getting rid of them. And they're called, I think, something like trichobezoars. And Mengele basically had to go to hospital when he was in Brazil because he had such a bad hairball caused by eating his own moustache. And so that is kind of what nearly rumbled him, because when he had to go there under a false passport, issued by someone else who was much younger, much older, I can't remember. He was there in hospital with a hairball. Now, again, you would like to think that someone like Mengele, again, no introduction needed for our viewers, would have been had a worse punishment than getting a hairball. But that is indeed exactly what happened to him. So these guys living in hiding, it is not, it's not the greatest fun in the world, but at the same time, they're living under paranoia. But you know what? They're all right broadly, apart from Eichmann. Most of the people living in Argentina, most of the people living in Syria, most of the people living in Egypt, most of the people staying in Germany are fine. And why are most people staying in Germany fine if they're real Nazi war criminals? Because they are helping the Allies.
Yeah.
And that is why we have this slide about the hired. The best way to escape ultimately was to offer your services to the Allied nations and to help them. And I mean all the Allied nations, British, French, Russians, Americans, you name it. And then here I talk about some of those who basically helped us and the Russians. Horst Kopku rounded up a lot of SOE agents responsible for their execution. Morally difficult because we executed spies and the Germans executed spies. So we can't really win that one morally. He was a war criminal nevertheless. And he was announced to be dead in about 1946, 1947. He actually dies in 1980 something. And he was used by the British intelligence services, for quite a long time. Klaus Barbie, a man who, Woody, you and I are all have to remember his trial in Lyon in the 80s. Former Gestapo officer in Lyon. I can't swear on YouTube, but if I could, the words could not, be stronger. Was a man who knew a lot of naughty secrets.
Yeah.
Offered himself to the British intelligence, French intelligence, American intelligence. He would give away where the uranium mines are in the Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia. He would give, names of various people who could help in the war against the Russians. And in the end, he is spirited out down a rat line by the Americans at the end of the war because he's helped. I won't mention all these guys, but Burkhardt, or Friedrich Burkhardt, was an Einsatzgruppen leader who was used by British intelligence. Heinz Felfer was used by Russian intelligence. Viktor Araks, a piece of shit, Baltic Nazi, was used by British intelligence. All these guys were hired. And you have to say, people talk about Operation Paperclip and stuff like this. You go, yeah, fine. It's fine. People always say to me on social media, Operation Paperclip, and that means that, we use these people. And I go, it was worse than Operation Paperclip. People say, Werner von Braun helped people get to the moon despite using slave labor. Yeah, he was a nice guy compared to this lot, right?
Yeah.
But put yourself in 45, put yourself in 46. You've got a new front opening with the Soviet Union. You've got, the Iron Curtain. Are you always going to employ the deputy head boy? Or ultimately, maybe the nasty guys have got the intelligence you need. And it's very morally simple for us as historians to turn around and say, you know what? We shouldn't use that person because they did a nasty thing. Hundreds of thousands of people did nasty things. And, I would say if I was running an intelligence network run by the Brits at the end of the war, you're trying to tell me that there are hundreds of thousands of Nazi war criminals and you're telling me I can't use 8 of them.
Yeah.
And are you telling me that also, and even Churchill expressed his point of view, that if we ultimately run down these people forever, we're going to end up the spotlight put on ourselves?
Yeah.
I would love to write a book about Allied war crimes in the war. Is there a book like that, Woody? Is there a book?
It's hinted at here and there. Individual cases, aren't there? Some of the things that happened in Italy, but yeah, they don't. No one cares. They don't. They don't sell. No, people don't. There's a lot of head in the sand, and no.
But did the Allies commit war crimes during the war? Yeah, of course. I'm not talking about bombing. I'm not going to that.
Yeah.
But did British Americans shoot unarmed prisoners? It's bound to have happened.
Yeah.
It's bound to have happened. Of course it is. We know that. War's not a pretty business. And so I think that people back then had a much less black and white, a much grayer idea of what war criminality meant.
Yeah.
Today, I think it's a much more simple idea, blah, blah, blah. Well, maybe we don't, because when we look at the Middle East, maybe we look at Russia, Ukraine, so on and so forth, maybe we're a bit more sophisticated now, and it all depends what side you're on. Obviously, I hope, like you, Woody, I'm on the side of Ukraine,
mm-hmm.
And I know that it must be Russian war crimes, but also I suspect, there's bound to be bad stuff going on both sides.
Well, wars bring out the worst in people. I mean, that's just human nature. And I think the other thing that we ought to just briefly mention is that in the 1950s, when these events are happening, the fear is the communists, the red surge is that not only is it going to be the Soviet Union and China, but they might even work together. The horror upon horror. When we were fighting World War II, at least the Axis were kind of pulling in different directions. The Germans, Italians, and Japanese weren't really connected, but the fear now is all these powers could start working together under the banner of communism. So what's more important, stopping and preventing a new world war, or
exactly
mopping up some war criminals who deserve justice, but there's a bigger game afoot, I guess.
I think you're absolutely right. And when people say to me, why didn't the Americans, the British, and the Israelis and do more to hunt down Nazi war criminals? You go, well, you know what? The war was over in 45.
Yeah.
You know what? And they didn't. There were new battles to fight. And when people say, why didn't the Israelis do more than just hunt Eichmann and blah blah blah? And you go, well, they have problems on their own doorstep. It was the Arab nations represented an existential threat in the 50s and 60s. Yeah. So the Nazis didn't represent a threat to Israel. So what are you going to put your intelligence resources into? You put them into fighting, the Arabs on your doorstep. And, and the idea that you've got, that you're just going to employ the nice guys to get your intelligence, it doesn't work. So that's why basically I have that slide about the hired, because, that's they're horrible. The Eichmann kidnap, it's a great story. And I think that you got your viewers are going to know a lot about it. I think that what I want to get away from is the idea that it was kind of masterminded by Simon Wiesenthal. Simon Wiesenthal had bugger all to do with the Eichmann kidnap. The man who is the hero, I think there's been a new book about him, is Fritz Bauer, top left. Politically very left-wing, a communist, locked up, I think, by the Nazis, ends up being working as a state prosecutor for the German state of Hesse. And he gets a tip-off from a Lothar Hermann, who is his family in Argentina. He's a blind guy, and his daughter is going out with someone who he eventually identifies as being the son of Eichmann. And it's that tip that really brings Eichmann to justice, because the Israelis, they go out, and I think it's 58 from memory, and they surveil him, they spy on him. Yeah. And that one in the middle is secret footage carried out by the Israelis under the command of Issa Harel, bottom left, head of Mossad. And you've got to imagine, this is a whole lecture in itself, how hard it is to kidnap someone in 1960 off the streets of Argentina, with cars that break down all the time, with no communications between each other. It's very, very, very difficult. And then how do you smuggle this guy out of there? I think that people need to read the book or watch movies about how that happened. I don't want to give it away.
Well, we have a show on World War II TV in 2 weeks' time with Jack Fairweather about Fritz Bauer, a gay Jew, and all the work he did, which is fantastic. Because you say Wiesenthal is a little bit...
stolen valor. So if you've got that show coming up, I won't give it away. I don't give it away, but there he is. There's Eichmann, bottom right, in his lovely sleep mask. It's like he's flying on economy there, doesn't it? Indeed, he was, in many ways. But Wiesenthal is a man I write a lot about. And a lot of viewers will know Simon Wiesenthal is the premier, kind of hunter down of Nazis. And it's claimed that throughout his career, Simon Wiesenthal, 1,100 Nazis, maybe 1,000 he brought to justice. You know what? And when you lift up the rug, you get the answer maybe about 8. And there's even one Israeli ambassador said Simon Wiesenthal may have been a Nazi hunter, but he was not a Nazi finder. And a lot of what Wiesenthal said was bunkum, was myth. And when I started researching this book, I thought Wiesenthal was a total hero. And I realized that so much of what he did was self-publicizing. It was bullshit, frankly. Innocent men like Friedrich Wallace, at the bottom, a Chicago guy, was harangued by Wiesenthal in the 70s, but totally innocent Canadian. An example of Wiesenthal's lies are top left slide are 3 people. Germans killed by, God, would you remember? Is it Operation Greif, the Skorzeny deception operation during the Battle of the Bulge, when Skorzeny sent a load of fake GIs disguised? And the Americans shot them, right? They shot them, right? So those are Germans, top left, disguised as GIs, and that who were shot by the Americans. And that picture was published in Life magazine as an example of what happens to Germans if they dress up as Americans. They get shot, right? The bottom left picture, which looks, I will add, startling familiar to the top left, Undeniably so. Would you agree?
Yeah.
See, that is an image that Wiesenthal drew according to what he had seen in Mauthausen as a concentration camp victim. Now, there's no doubt that Simon Wiesenthal was in various camps, although not in as many camps as he claimed. And the idea that that is his first-hand, knowledge of an execution in Mauthausen is complete rubbish, because you know that he's copied that from Life magazine. And so as a result, you've got this very, very problematic figure who is making stuff up. He also claims that he was in the partisans during the war and we built a lot of concrete emplacements. And then you sort of go, partisans don't build concrete emplacements. It doesn't happen. So as a result, a lot of people say, what did Wiesenthal really do during the war? Now, there's a lot of bullshit about Wiesenthal. Was he in the concentration camp? Yes, he was. Was he Jewish? Yes, he was. Did he hunt as many Nazis as he did? No, he didn't. Was he actually looking for Nazi treasure, Nazi gold? Topic of my new documentary, the last hunt for Nazi gold on Sky, in probably in the new year. Yeah, that's what he was doing more of. He was a very, very problematic figure who bigged himself up in many, many ways. And so part of my book really goes to town on why Wiesenthal was, basically a bullshitter. And then when my book came out, the Wiesenthal Center, and Wiesenthal already died, Wiesenthal Center really laid into me. And they were really saying, oh, Guy Walters is another David Irving anti-Semite. And I was going, well, F you, I'm not. And Danny Finkelstein, now Lord Finkelstein, obviously, a well-respected member of the Jewish community, whose father or grandfather had founded the Wiener Library. And he wrote a very nice piece about me in the Jewish Chronicle saying, I've read Guy's book. He's basically not an arsehole. I'm always very grateful to Danny Finkelstein and Lord Finkelstein now for saying that, because you know what, you can attack a Jewish figure without being anti-Semitic. Yeah. And at the time, 20 years ago, it felt very problematic for me. And I remember saying to my wife, you know what, I think that Wiesenthal's, a bad one. He's a wrong one. Oh, but you got to be careful. I went, well, I'm going for it. So,
it's like Christopher Hitchens and Mother Teresa, isn't it? It's
exactly. And then just getting down towards the end, I mean, we've got later Nazi hunters, and the people I really respect, unlike Wiesenthal, are bottom middle. The Office of Special Investigations in America, a man called Eli Rosenbaum, who's just retired. I mean, he is a man who have you been to the United States recently, Woody?
Not really. Well, a couple of years ago, yeah.
Right. You probably filled in, and maybe they've stopped them now. I haven't been there for 3 years, but an I-95 visa form. And it was a yellow form or a green form from memory. And it was going a few years ago. And there's a box saying, have you ever been a member of the Nazi Party? Between 93, I mean, I don't know if you remember that, but I'm sure some viewers do. And you sort of go, right, well, why would I take that? And Eli, I'm proud to call a friend. I would say it's the greatest Nazi hunter who lived, because he is a Harvard-educated lawyer who could have made an absolute hell ton of money, but he decided what he's going to do was to root out in America any Nazi who ended up there. And I think he basically rooted out about 100 Nazis. That's a lot. It's a lot. And got them sent back, either put on trial or sent back to their home countries where they'd faced trial.
And did it through legal and means, through the process.
Through the due process, 100%.
Yeah.
Then you got the Klaasfelds, Surgeon Beate Klaasfeld, a Franco-German couple, and Beate, who I interviewed in Paris on the right. These guys who would get the Nobel Peace Prize. It was Beate Klaasfeld. Well, while Wiesenthal had stayed in Europe, it was she who would go to the streets of La Paz on the left, Bolivia, and say, "You've got Klaus Barbie," and would say that in a dictatorship. She would sit on a bench in a dictatorship with an old woman whose son had been a victim of Barbie in France. during the war, and she would risk arrest in a dictatorship, and she would end up getting death threats. And you can see bottom left, these are some letters she showed me, people sending her letters. And I think you can see when you get a letter like that with a cross of stamps or a swastika of stamps on the back of it, you know that people don't like you very much. And one morning in her car park in her block of flats in Paris in the early 80s, late 70s, a car bomb went off in her car. So it proved that she was, the neo-Nazi world was still alive and sadly all too well. And then I talk a little bit about the other retributive justice carried out by Israelis and Jews. And you got this man here called Anton Kunzler, his cover name, for a man who carried out with a Mossad operation that brought to trial, not to trial, but basically after the Eichmann kidnap, tracked down a man called Herbert Zuckers, who was a Latvian Nazi who carried out something called the Rumbula massacre. And the Israelis decided after the Eichmann kidnap, they're never going to be able to fly people over and extradite them unofficially, and it was best just to kill them. And so I write in the book about how Anton Kunzler disguised himself, made friends with Herbert Zuckers in Argentina and Uruguay, and he and some of his fellow agents lured him into a bungalow in Montevideo one morning. And when Herbert Zuckers walked in, he saw 4 20-year-old men in their pants. And it sounds like the beginning of some terrible porn film, but actually it was much worse than that for Zuckers, because they bludgeoned him to death and they put them in a trunk and they put a message on it saying, "From those who never forget." And that's a picture of his bloated body, bottom right, forgive you if it's squeamish, of him being discovered 2 weeks later by the Uruguayan police. So, some of this hunting was not pretty at all. And we know how brutal the Israeli intelligence services can be. And they were brutal from the get-go. Just getting near the end now, you'll be glad to hear. But when I talk about the old Nazi hunting thing, it's a kind of cultural thing, because, when I sold this whole topic, to my editor, quite a few years ago, people think that escaping Nazis, and you alluded to this earlier, Woody, where, it's all about people hiding in jungles, airstrips, evil mofos. It's the Odessa fire. It's the boys
planning the Fourth Reich, of course, as well.
It's the Fourth Reich. Marathon Man. There's a film bottom right there called Angel of Death, which is a really schlocky movie about Mengele, which starts off scene 1, Paraguay, and it shows a beach with the sea. And you go, well, that's really well researched, because everyone knows Paraguay is landlocked. But it becomes a kind of Nazi hunting, the escape Nazis from justice becomes this kind of meme, I suppose, in modern parlance, in the 60s and 70s. And, I suppose 60s and 70s, that was only, 20, 30 years away from the war. I mean, you were born in, 69?
Yep. Yeah.
So that's 24 years after the war. And what's 24 years ago today? It's 2001. It's nothing, right? Nothing.
Yeah, crazy.
I mean, 2001, I can remember that like yesterday, right? I think that was the end of the war from when you and I were born. That's nuts. So that's when this stuff came out, and so I think that, that image of Nazis on the run and living half the hog is, it's rubbish, because as we've seen, where was, Eichmann living? Where Mengele living? They weren't living in great places. They were in crappy bungalows in Argentina. They were in, rubbish places in Paraguay. They were sitting in attics in Hackney. They weren't living in jungles like Gregory Peck, top right, with, wearing dinner jackets and black tie. It was just rubbish. It just didn't happen. I think that finally getting near the end, the question is, what justice does await some of these people? I think Simon Lord, a follower on Twitter, asked, well, of the listed criminals, what percentage were brought to justice? I said to him, there were no kind of formal lists. There was a Crocast list I mentioned earlier, that black-covered book. That only had 60,000 in it. But I think, going back to Gerald Draper's point, the sheer volume of criminality, you can't count how many Nazi war criminals there were. You really can't. And how many brought to justice? Probably no more than about 4 or 5% of them, really.
Yeah, I mean, Otto Waitman, that's Otto, that's his nickname on Facebook. Waitman Bjorn makes this point: is the number brought to justice is 10% is being very, very generous.
Yeah, I think 10% generous. Krokow's list. I mean, you could count with Russian trials, East German trials, which actually were in the tens of thousands. But ultimately, I think Waitman's about right. It must be about 10%.
But I think that's why those films you just mentioned, why they in some ways were popular, because it's like the Inglourious Basterds thing, is that you get to see Gregory Peck as Mengele gunned down at the end of the film in the fictitious version. Odessa file, John Voight throws the Odessa off the roof. But so you get a bit of kind of pretend justice, because I think ultimately that's what we're moving towards, is that there are generations after the war who felt that justice wasn't brought, and so the films kind of provide a subliminal version of that, even if it's not real.
I think that's a really good point. I think it's a really good point. And, and we know that very few brought justice. Mengele was never brought justice. He dies in 1979, drowns off Bertioga Beach in Brazil. His skull is dug up 6 years later in Embu. That's the bottom left, his skull. Top right, Bormann. Everyone thinks Bormann's escaped. I went to Paraguay, and there's an old deer sits in this graveyard in a place called Ita, and you say, which one's Bormann Cemetery? And any day of the week, she'll say, is that one on the left, that one on the right? Give her 5 pesos, and she'll say any old crap. Klaus Barbie brought to justice, in Lyon, back where he had, been head of the Gestapo. And then Erich Priebke, who was an SS captain. I went and interviewed him in Rome in 2006 because he'd been brought back there from Argentina, extradited finally. And it was really weird meeting an SS captain who had carried out this massacre in the Argentine caves, and he had personally pulled the trigger and shot at least 2 to 4 people in the back of their heads, innocent people, in a reprisal. And, when I turned up, because he was under permanent imprisonment in his flat because he's too old to go to prison. So you had to surrender your passport when you went up. And I went up to his flat. It's 10 o'clock in the morning, central Rome. And his flat was full of kind of German stuff everywhere. And he said, 10 o'clock in the morning, he said, do you want a glass of wine? I went, yeah, all right, because I want a good interview. And also, I'm never going to say no to a glass of wine. But, even from a Nazi war criminal. And so I thought, I want a good interview, so you've got to be empathetic. So we had a good 2 hours. We were interviewing about how he'd escaped and whether it was in Odessa and what it was like being on the run in Argentina and so on and so forth. And at the time, Ratzinger, the German Pope, Benedict, or whatever he was on the papal throne. And Priebke says to me, so I've written to the Pope. And Priebke obviously was German. And goes, I've asked the Pope if he can help me, gain some clemency, get out of prison. And I went, well, okay, Eric, what of it? And he goes, but the reason why the Pope hasn't replied to me, do you know why he hasn't replied to me? I don't know. And then he said to me, you know what, guy? He's still afraid of the Jews. And I go, okay, this is like 70 years on, and those Nazi habits still haven't died out. Right?
Yeah.
And that's why when people say, you know what, don't bring them to justice anymore. This is the last slide. Don't bring them to justice anymore. When we bring a bookkeeper or this and that. Yeah. Sodom, bring them to justice. They were part of it. And so when Priebke says that to me, you know what? I just go, you are still a criminal. You are still a criminal.
Reminds me of when I met a certain German SS tank commander's widow a few years ago in Normandy, and she was asking me, of course, you never went to any of Hitler's parties, did you? And I was like, No, I didn't. Oh, they were so good. And I'm like, I don't care. I don't care how freaking good his parties were. What's the point? But she was an unrepentant Nazi. And
Yeah.
I won't, and yeah, she was living openly and whatever. But it's justice that has no time limit, I suppose,
Well, there can't be on a crime like that. I don't think there can be. Genocide is quite a bad crime.
Yeah, pretty much. Well, that's your
those are a few of my books. I've written a few more since then. That website is now dead, but you just get hold of me on Twitter at Guy Walters.
Yeah, brilliant stuff. Well,
apologies.
I mean, we'll end it there, Guy, because I mean, as always, we could keep on talking, but it does raise lots of questions that we're going to try and tackle some of them during this series. Is what is justice? How long can justice wait? Who is suffering worse? The person kind of living in hiding, fear for his life, the person who maybe serves 10 years in prison and is out openly. All these are questions that I think people will take away and ponder on. If you go and work for the Allies, does that somehow redeem you somehow? I don't know. But I think that's the point with this series. It's that the war crimes trials are complicated. There's lots of nuance involved, and I think it will raise questions. So, Guy, what a fantastic presentation. Starting off, I look forward to seeing you at some point in the future, and good luck with the TV show Sky next year. What's it called again? Plug it again one more time. The
Last Hunt for Nazi Gold. And I'm not going to give it away, but we do find something.
Cool. Brilliant. Well, let's hope it's ratings as well, because that'd be good. So, folks, 2 shows tomorrow. We're looking at Japanese war crimes with Adam Wakeling in the morning, and then we are looking at the Barbie trial later on the day. So, as always, click like and subscribe. I will see you all again next week. This is Paul. Tomorrow. Sorry, this is Paul Woodard from World War II TV saying enjoy the rest of your Tuesday. Thanks, Guy. Thanks, viewers. Bye.